Hi guys, today we're going to be taking a look at a bunch of sim titles in VR. So we've already covered what hardware I would recommend for VR, but which game provides the best experience for you from a visual fidelity and smoothness perspective, along with considering audio and force feedback. Now, a little disclaimer here. Whilst a game might be very good in how it is portrayed in VR, it might not have much of a multiplayer community. So if you are playing these in single player, you might be okay, but if you want to play some of these in multiplayer, you will probably also want to consider how many people you're going to be playing against. So without further ado, let's take a look at these titles in reverse order. So least enjoyable in VR first. First up, we have RaceRoom Racing Experience. Now, whilst this might be the bottom of the pile, it is still an enjoyable experience. It is relatively smooth in frame rate. I did get a little bit of frame drop in it, even with the settings I had, but I haven't optimized it as much as, say, ACC, which I've been racing quite a lot recently, so that might make me slightly more biased towards that title than others. I found the dashboard and the car interior felt a little bit flat and lifeless, and whilst the big elements of the dashboard were readable, they weren't always that obvious, so it was difficult to pick out the finer details. I also found that the UI, when you completed a lap, was a tad annoying. It would pop up with the positions and distances of different drivers, and because it wasn't on screen before, it was a little bit jarring, so it would take my attention away from my driving and onto the aforementioned UI item. Lighting wasn't too bad. I thought this was a better stab at lighting than, say, Assetto Corsa or iRacing. Both of those seem to have some issues with their lighting. This didn't do too bad a job there, and you can see reflections in the glass, for example, on the side window, and having the mirrors enabled by default was a nice touch, but it just helped with the immersion. And I did get an enjoyable experience in driving through a few laps. I actually did a couple of races with the BMW GT3 in this title. But you can see here, for example, that UI pop-up that I was talking about, and that I did find jarring because it's just at the side of your vision, so not quite into the range of being your peripheral vision, and because of that position on screen, it did feel a little jarring. It was good to get a nice view outside though. For some of the other games I struggled a little bit, but partly that's due to the height of the seat, and you can adjust the height in those titles, so I haven't given them any downgrade on their performance based on the default seating position. Next up, we have Assetto Corsa, the original Assetto Corsa. An oldie, but still a goodie. Now, the biggest off-putting element of this game I found was the lighting. It's just really bright and washed out. I know there are third-party reshaders that you can install which will improve that, but it was a little painful. I'm not driving the same car in this title because unfortunately the M6 wasn't available, but I tried to pick something which was similar enough. And these are GT2s. I quite liked the detail on the traffic. Position the car at the back of the field here so you can see the detail of the cars as they come past. That was very good. Probably one of the better titles for how much detail you can have on the cars externally. But that is at the cost of your local surroundings. The cockpit is probably better detailed than RaceRoom, but it's not quite up there with the newer titles like Automobilista 2. I'm using some plugins here, so this isn't necessarily a vanilla experience, but the UI was simple to the point, and that helps with keeping your attention on the road. You can't see reflections in the glass, but you can see some detailing around it. As I said, the cockpit felt a little sparse. The dash was simple and clear. Obviously you're using the UI mostly for your details, so it's not as big a deal that it's not that readable, but if you wanted that added immersion of switching off those UI elements, then you're going to struggle for getting enough information on screen. With the lighting being so washed out, it didn't really feel like I was in that environment, and then partly that's due to it being a clear day, but it still felt a little bit too white. It's not warm enough. Overall, the frame rate was pretty solid. I did have a couple of frame drops, which was a bit disappointing considering that most of the time I'm well within the limits of the headset I'm using, which is the valve index. But on occasion I was dropping below 80 frames, and that was apparent when I was driving, unfortunately. I could drop detail down, some detail on the cars, and that would help matters a little bit. Next up we have iRacing. Here I'm using the M4 GT3 on, again, Laguna Seca. So as we have a clear sky here, on testing with clouds you can actually see the shadow of the clouds rolling over, which is pretty cool. The cockpit detailing is relatively straightforward, but you can read all of the dash, which is amazing. It's pretty easy to see when you've selected the pit limiter, for example, which is definitely helpful when you are trying to race. And if you wanted to switch off the UI elements, that would be useful. You can see here that by default the mirrors are switched off, which could count negatively towards the game. However, you can re-enable those in the graphics settings, so it's not terrible. I found the lighting to be a little too much on the warm side. It is a hot sunny day, and the sun is quite high in the sky, so it shouldn't really be quite this warm. But it didn't detract too much from the game. Can't really see the glass at all in the game, which is not great for immersion. And the by default virtual mirror is a tad distracting. In fact, a lot of the UI being as central as it is, it's a little distracting. But that can be changed, of course. We're not racing against other cars here. We've got a Ghost, which is, you can see, darting around in front of us. Overall, I feel it was not a bad game. It's very enjoyable to play, but it lacks just a little bit of that immersive detail. There's some really nice elements to the cockpit that you can see the serial numbers on the surrounding foam on the roll cage, which is pretty cool. But it still felt less like you're in the car. As I didn't get to drive in traffic in this, I could only really gauge how the cars would look against the Ghost, and they looked pretty decent. I think if I was able to experience the game with traffic, unfortunately I'm not out of the rookies yet, and there's another video series on that soon. But because I'm not able to race in traffic just yet, I've been unable to gauge what they look like. I'm pretty sure they are up there with rFactor 2's graphic fidelity in terms of traffic, but it's still hard to gauge. In third place we have Assetto Corsa Competizione. Now, I've spent quite a bit of time working on optimizing my graphics settings for this game, so it's possible that out of the box it would have scored a lot lower than this, but with the optimized settings that I have, the cars look pretty decent. The shadows could be better, but the cars look pretty decent. The car interior is probably the best of any game. You can see the mirrors are enabled, the virtual mirrors are enabled by default, and they are stunning. And you have a readable dashboard. You can actually get information from your dashboard, so you could switch off all the other UI and still have enough information to be getting on with. That's all good stuff. It has good lighting, I think. It has quite realistic lighting. I feel that maybe it could be better on the frame rate front. It definitely drops below 80 frames a second on my hardware, and I have a 3080 installed on my rig, so you know, it's not like I have old hardware. So the fact that I still get quite a lot of heavy frame drop, especially in AI traffic, it's not great for those that are running mid-range systems, and I had to take that into account as well. You can just about see some glass detail, so you can see reflections on the glass, which is pretty cool, and it's more obvious in wet weather conditions. All good stuff. The biggest problems with it is that you have to run it with a lot of the settings really pushed down to be able to get a decent frame rate from, and you still then struggle for overall system performance. So that's why it's not top dog. It still, of course, provides a very good racing experience, as do all of these games. In a surprising second place, and one of the oldest titles that we have here, is rFactor 2. Now, it has its other problems, and we won't necessarily go into those. It has had a revamped UI, so might be worth talking about that at a later date. But lighting wise, it's not the best game, it's not the worst. It's okay. Car detail, it is definitely one of the better titles, with you being able to really ramp that up, and you see a lot of detail on the cars. You also get that car movement that just feels a little bit more alive than some of the other titles that we've spoken about. In here you can see quite good cockpit detail, not the best, but it has a perfectly functional dashboard that you can use. I also have a UI element in front of that, as you can see, and that's a third-party UI. Nearly got caught out by the traffic there. But yeah, it's got a pretty decent feel to it. It feels much more like you're in that vehicle. It doesn't have visible glass, as far as I can tell. I didn't see any during my playtime, and the giant sun visor is a little distracting, but that's mostly on me. I could have lowered my car seat. I'm quite high in the car here, and that's from my touring car exploits from a previous period of my sim racing career. The vehicle is, like I said, pretty good to look at, as is the traffic, and the track has that feeling like it's well used, as you'd expect from Laguna Seca. You have patches of different coloured tarmac, and it's bumpy, and that all is transmitted both visually and through the force feedback. You also hear it in the sound. The UI is simple and to the point, even with the standard UI. I've got obviously a modified one here. Having the mirrors enabled by default again adds to the immersion, and it is silky smooth. I didn't experience any frame drop at all. I had a frame rate counter on and it didn't drop below 80 frames a second with the settings that I have here, where most of the other titles at least had 1 or 2 blips. I think the only other one that didn't have a single blip was RaceRoom. But yeah, it was a very good racing experience. I mean, if I was just doing single player, this would be probably the environment that I spent most of my time in, but because I do a lot of multiplayer racing, I'm unlikely to pick up this game that often. I will possibly revisit it because of the changed UI they have. I'll see if the community has grown at all since I was last playing back in September. Finally, we have the VR experience winner, which is Automobilista 2. The interior is up there with Assetto Corsa Competizione, very close. The virtual mirrors are positioned well. The UI is not too disruptive. The traffic looks really pretty sleek. Lighting's really good. You get those god rays coming in from a low sun, and yeah, it's really quite nice how they've set this up. The only downside that I can see is the force feedback could be better, and the physics aren't on par with some other games, but as a racing experience in VR, it is very immersive. It feels a lot more realistic than some of the other titles that I've been trying out. When you get close to the traffic, you can just see how detailed the cars are. Like, you can probably achieve similar detailing on other games, but probably at the expense of a smooth frame rate, whereas this barely had any frame drop throughout playing. It's not quite as smooth as rFactor, but not far off. And like I said, it definitely felt like the most immersive experience from the 6 games I tried. So the good news is that all of these games can provide you with an enjoyable VR experience, and that's great news. I mean, we all want to be able to play the games that we love in the most immersive environment we can. So that's all good. Automobilista 2 seems to make the best compromises to give you a good experience, but I prefer, say, the physics in Assetto Corsa Competizione to that game, so I'm more likely to pick up ACC than I am AMS2. Everyone has their own opinion on this, but that's where my ball sits in camp. So I hope you enjoyed this video and that you learned something from it. Hopefully you try out some of these games, and until next time, goodbye guys.